Okay, so good afternoon everybody and welcome back, and thank you for joining us for the second of our two spotlight webinars today at the Catchment Data and Evidence Forum. So our webinar this afternoon is being presented by Hannah Worker from the Freshwater Habitats Trust on identifying important freshwater areas. So just before we kick off, just a quick reminder of the housekeeping. We are recording the session today, and again we'll share that on the CABA website after the event. And just a reminder, we're going to have a bit of a discussion and Q&A with Hannah at the end of her presentation. So if you have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And if you've got any general comments to make or links that you want to share, then please use the chat for that. So I'm now delighted to welcome Hannah and ask her to join us on the screen, who's going to tell us more about Important Freshwater approach that they've developed and how it can be used to help target projects to protect, restore and improve connectivity for freshwater wildlife. So thank you, Hannah, over to you.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me today. So if I just share my screen. Great, can everyone see that okay?
Yep, that's looking good, Hannah.
Excellent, fab. So yes, I'm going to talk today about the Important Freshwater Areas approach. So it's a new approach that FHT has developed with other freshwater experts to underpin underpin and help develop practical delivery and to guide conservation. So move on. So at the heart of the approach is the key principle that to stem the decline in freshwater biodiversity and prevent further extinctions of freshwater species, both regionally and nationally, it's essential that we protect those remaining high quality areas, so the important freshwater areas, and then strategically restore and create new habitats to extend these areas and improve the connectivity between them and therefore resilience in species populations. So it has sort of several broad aims. One, to actually identify where these sort of biodiversity hotspots are, these important freshwater areas, to enhance their protection and freshwater protection in general, so using it as an awareness raising tool and feed into planning. As I've said previously, underpinning the developments of actual practical works to create and restore freshwater strategically, and also to identify gaps in sort of the data that we have and in knowledge, and use that to prioritise where we go next with surveying and monitoring. A key part of the approach is to try and tackle some of the limitations of existing policy and approaches. So at the moment, quite a lot of policy doesn't look across the whole of the freshwater landscape. So it doesn't particularly include the smaller waters, so ponds and sort of headwaters, fens and flushes. And in Europe, we're still seeing a decline in freshwater biodiversity. So the latest WFD monitoring, only 14% of our rivers were meeting good ecological status, and looking at kind of the wider landscape as well. So from our research, and this is coming from the Water Friendly Farming project at Loddington, so it's in partnership with the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust and the Environment Agency. But as part of this, across 3 stream catchments, there have been landscape wetland plant surveys over the course of 10 years. And it appears that there's about a 1% decline in wetland plant diversity, so gamma diversity across the landscape each year. So we are slowly losing our species. So the idea of the IFA is to sort of kind of change up the approach and to see if we can do things a bit differently and do things kind of a bit quicker, and actually start to reverse that decline. So for the IFAs, it's a process of collecting and collating data, so bringing in, I'll go through this in more detail with an example later, but bringing in records you have for species of conservation concern, priority habitats where you have water dependent designated sites, bringing in results from the Water Framework Directive monitoring, and also any proxy data you have, and particularly noting the limitations of the data. And the example I'll give later is a more data deficient catchment, so there's quite a bit of actually understanding those limitations involved. You then compile all this data in, and use it to do spatial analysis to look where you have hotspots, where you have restricted and widespread species, where you have those designated sites, and then to use this to interpret and kind of designate these IFAs depending on a set of criteria. And I will go into this in more detail. That was a very quick run through. And up to this point, we have analysis for Oxfordshire, the Thame and OCC catchments again, so that's sort of Oxfordshire Bucks area, also out into the Breckland region and Yorkshire. So a few places and nationally. So it can be applied at all sorts of scales. Right, so I'm going to go through how we did the analysis for the River Thame catchment. So this was catchment-based analysis, particularly for the Thame Catchment Partnership to use to inform how we move forward with delivering practical improvements for the catchment and how we actually look to restore biodiversity for the area. So the River Thame catchment is pretty typical of lowland England, so quite an intensive landscape. There are issues with water quality, sort of widespread issues from sewage, runoff, a wide range of things. And quite a few settlements dotted in between. So the first thing you want to do is actually start looking at where you have your water habitat. So this is the River Thame, then you add in all the streams and then also all the ponds into that network and the floodplains. So we really do want to look across the whole freshwater habitats, and this map isn't going to include everything. There's still many smaller waters, so ditches and headwaters that they're not easy to map. So it's sort of as good as we can get at this stage, but yes, it's not everything, but it is really key that you do bring in data from all of those freshwater habitats. So for small waters, they can actually make up the vast majority of the area of freshwater available. And you can find that about 2/3 of species. So for ponds and standing water habitats, you can actually find 2/3 species will live in those habitats. So it's really important to kind of focus away from the main river and also including floodplain in this as well. And just a bit of evidence to kind of back up why it's important to look across, everything that you've got. So again, this is from the Water Friendly Farming Project at Loddington. And this was looking at the proportion, so the species richness of wetland plants across ponds, streams and ditches in these 3 different catchments. And ponds in these areas had the most species diversity compared to kind of the other habitats surveyed. So, yeah. The next thing you want to start looking at is where you have those designated sites. So you can see the Thame doesn't have a huge number, and actually I think only 1 or 2 will actually mention the freshwater habitats in their designation. So these are brought in because they're likely to be kind of the better sites really, and you'd hope they would be, being SSSIs. So looking at where you might have that kind of nice terrestrial habitat, and you might have good water quality and nice habitats within them, even if it's not been designated for that particular reason. I think Spartum Fen is one of the only 1 or 2 that are designated for their freshwater wildlife in the catchment that you can see on the screen there, just there. The next thing is to bring in priority habitats. So in the Thame catchment, we don't have a huge number, and there's a longer list on the next slide, but we do have quite a lot of floodplain grazing marsh along here, some chalk streams along here, and also some small pockets of fen and some reed beds, but it's quite large areas where it's just quite intensively used landscape. So yes, this is the full list of everything you would look for. It's just in the Thame we don't really have any blanket box and that kind of thing. The next thing you bring in is looking at where you have high status. So from the Water Framework Directive, bringing in where you've got kind of high classifications. So for fish and invertebrates are what's shown on the screen right now. There aren't any water bodies, unfortunately, in the catchment that do reach good or high status, but you can still focus on those particular classifications for those particular kind of groups. And the next step, so you bring in your designated sites and your habitat, and the next step is to actually look at the species that you have in the catchment. So there's, this is just for species of conservation concern, so freshwater species of conservation concern. And it's a long list that's been put together, again, with lots of consultation with freshwater and species experts. And these are, so there's about just under 1,000 species on the list, and looking at records from 1988. So that's still quite a long time ago, but you kind of picking up some of those historic species where you might still have, if they're still there, fantastic, or you might find that they can come back from the seed bank. So still going back to quite a long way. And it doesn't include bats, birds, algae, zooplankton, and kind of groups that are maybe under-recorded, or there isn't necessarily been as much research into them and not as well documented. So the key groups are looking at the invertebrates and plants, also looking at kind of mosses, and so some of the mammals, fish, so yeah, wide range, so really inclusive list of all sorts of different freshwater species. And these will have conservation status, so very inclusive again, so whether they're in the Habitats Directive, they're priority species, the Wildlife and Conservation Act, Countryside Act, red data listed, IUCN, so really inclusive conservation status as well. And this is what that data looks like in the Thame Catchment. So this is all of the, data search with local record centres and potentially other local recorders that might be in there, might be in the area. So, and bringing this all into kind of one map and breaking this down between widespread and also restricted species. So widespread species might be things like great crested newt, so threatened but still quite prevalent across the landscape and quite good at dispersing and getting about. And restricted species might be something like tubular water dropwort, or there are loads on the other slides, but and particularly kind of invertebrates that maybe don't move about across the landscape, so much more vulnerable to extinction if they're lost from a particular site. Whereas, say, if you lost newts from a site, or great crested newts, they'd be much more likely to be able to colonise back in, whereas the restricted, much more limited. So looking across the Thame, when you start bringing this data in, and you do start pulling apart where you have species, it's kind of giving you an overview, but you can start picking out those hotspots for, where you've got clumpings of restricted species and where you've got clumpings of widespread species, and just sort of showing some of the areas. Again, I'll go into it in a bit more detail. So that kind of gives you a good idea of where you might have quite nice quality habitat already. These kind of maybe more uncommon and slightly more sensitive species to water quality might still be. So yes, breaking it down into the different groups, so looking at where the fish and amphibians are. In the Thame, we have records for brook lamprey and trout. There's just one stream that we think that, well, there's records for trout on, which is the Chalgrove, just at the bottom of the catchment, and eel as well, and looking at great crested newts and common toad. But with this data, it's just quite a good point with particularly great crested newts. There's quite a large number of records around Aylesbury, but that's also where there's a lot of development. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be particularly representative of their distribution across the catchment. So it's just worth bearing in mind those limitations with the data, and kind of looking at how you interpret it. And yes, there might be a large gap without sort of amphibians in this area. It could be that just people haven't been out recording. And with the wetland plants, so we found some really interesting old records through looking at the wetland plant species. So over, so down here, this is Spartum Fen. So this is one of the designated SSSI fen sites. And there were really nice old records for marsh hellebore, grass of Parnassus, and marsh stitchwort. So there are quite old records, and quite a key part of using this data is the sort of next steps of actually where you go back and survey and have a look if they're still there. But yeah, start pulling out that you do have quite a lot of these really interesting species potentially still here in the catchment. And species like tubular water dropwort. So this is typically a floodplain grazing marsh. So it likes grazing, it likes clean water, and would have most likely been quite common across the landscape, and in the Thame Catchment with those big floodplain areas, but now isolated to kind of just a few locations. So there's some over towards this end of the catchment and up around Shabbington Wood here. And species again like opposite-leaved pondweed, so lots of things that are quite sensitive to water quality. Just giving you an idea of actually, where are they in the landscape? We only had one record for stoneworts, which is sort of surprising, but we've now found another, so I'll get onto that a bit later. But that was over in these gravel pit lakes over here, again with the water qualities cleaner. From vertebrates, so it's quite differences in quite a few differences of where species are as well when you're kind of looking at vertebrates versus the plants. But yeah, some nice finds of some particular flies, so quite a few specialist flies up in some woodland habitat over here, and old records for white-clawed crayfish. We're not sure if they're still there, and it could be that they're now extinct, but there's potential that they could still be hanging on in these little headwater kind of upper reaches of the catchment up here. So yes, the next step is then kind of looking at where you do have these hotspots. So you can pull it out between different species depending on what, you know, what kind of where you want to take it and what you want to develop moving forward. But the key part is then looking at where you do have these hotspots, and in particular, the Tring reservoirs and gravel pit lakes had really quite large areas, quite large, for the Thame Catchment, quite a lot of diversity. And this is where you had lots of the stonework, or the stonework record, and Schuylkill water wort, and I think there was opposite-leaved pondweed there as well. It's quite a few species of indicators of good clean water. And quite a bit of this is a BBAT reserve, so that's fab, so that's being nicely managed. And over here you have Shabbington Wood, so big area of woodland, and again, lots of nice clean water, which is probably why lots of these species are still there. And there's also some floodplain areas coming out, so the waterstock area, this is on the floodplain of the main river channel. And Spartum Fen, so the fen I mentioned earlier as well. So it was Spartum Fen and these gravel pit lakes that actually had the highest density of species for the whole catchment. And we found 103 of conservation concern across the whole Thame. So not a huge number, but again, with it being such a kind of intensively used landscape, and also there not being a huge amount of records, it's maybe not too surprising that we're finding potentially not that many species of conservation concern. Lastly, you can also bring in kind of supplementary data. We didn't actually include this in the analysis for the Thame Catchment, but it's something that you could look to bring in. So where you've got clean water data, because so many of these species of conservation concern really do require that kind of cleaner, so low nutrient water. If you do have this sort of data, so this is collected by the Riverton Conservation Trust, and this is using little quick kits that you can see in this picture here. So they measure nitrate and phosphate, and they're really rapid, so it's quite rough and ready, but it does allow you to look across the landscape clean, where you've got clean and polluted water. So if you do have water quality data, it can be quite nice to add that in. But that's sometimes quite a luxury to have that at the landscape level. So yes, you basically add all this data in, and then do this sort of spatial analysis, and a lot comes down to interpretation as well, but there are set criteria that you then sort of work your way through to decide where you have these important freshwater areas. So if there's water dependent designated site, then that's automatically an IFA. So for instance, Spartum Fen as a SSSI automatically becomes an IFA. Where you have these diversity hotspots, so where you have large numbers of species of conservation concern, and particularly the presence of restricted species of conservation concern. So these species that don't easily move across the landscape and are more at risk of local extinction. Looking at the habitat, where if you have a high status water body from WFD, then fantastic, that should definitely be quite a key element. And looking at where you've got priority habitats as well. So for instance, where you've got grazing, so floodplain and grazing marsh habitat, potentially woodland, where you're more likely to have cleaner water coming in, and areas of clean water. So yeah, and for areas with data deficient, so like the Thame Catchment, we don't have a huge amount of data. There is quite a bit of scope to use expert knowledge to kind of guide this. So it is a tool. It's you know, you don't a lot of it comes down to the data you have. But yes, there is flexibility in bringing in local expert knowledge. So this reveals the all of this spatial analysis revealed the IFAs for the Thame Catchment. So particular standouts were, hopefully you can see my mouse here as I'm kind of indicating on the screen, but you've got areas of big floodplain along the main river. Over here you have those gravel pit lakes. Down here you have chalk streams, Spartum Fen, again, kind of big floodplain areas. Broughton, this was quite a high density of ponds. And Shabbington Wood, so woodland with high density of ponds as well, and also quite a clean stream because it's draining from that surrounding woodland. So what became apparent from this is there's actually the IFAs aren't particularly one type of habitat. It's such a range across this whole catchment. You really do have a mix of everything. So that was really nice to see. What you can see on the map here is, so places that meet those criteria are designated as the IFAs, but we also have a kind of a subcategory, so the potential IFAs. Now these are areas which seem very likely to be of equal importance for freshwater wildlife, but we don't have the data to back that up. So there might be records for kind of 1 or 2 restricted species, but because there's not been a lot of surveying there, we can't, it's sort of, you don't really have enough information to make that decision. So they're quite key areas to then prioritise actually going out and resurveying and monitoring, and potentially for all the IFAs, particularly in this area where we don't have that much data. A key next step is to actually go back and visit them and see, are these species still there? It's all well and good knowing that there is a record for marsh stitchwort in the kind of 90s, but is it actually still there now? Yes, just to summarise, the catchment is quite data deficient, but we can still pull out some quite key, information from it, from the data we have. It might not be as kind of, I guess, rigorous as other areas. So Saving New Forest has got amazing recording, but we can still pull out the IFAs. And we're now using this to actually, probably on a future slide, but to feed into our actions as a catchment partnership, and kind of use this to build momentum for our next steps and where we take this. So this is showing what we do with it next. So we have this data, we know where the key areas for freshwater wildlife are in the catchment. And now how as a partnership are we taking this forward? So I thought it'd be quite nice to just go through this because, it's actually the key part of how you use the data. So this is not just what FHT is doing, but this is projects and work across the whole Thame Catchment Partnership. So you can see we're doing quite a lot, and a lot of it is focused on those IFAs, and we've got new projects coming out, particularly using this to underpin that practical next step of delivery. So there are farmer groups that cover the IFA areas that we can help to engage with, and actually hopefully use this as quite a nice way of bringing them into this, going, you've got really nice habitat and this is why, and working with them to then improve what they have for freshwater wildlife. I'll go into a few cases in particular, but so for the Chilterns potential IFA, so again, there's along these, so this is the, so the Chilterns Hills, if you don't know it, there's quite a few, it's all a big chalk area, and on this side you've got chalk streams like the Chess and the Misbourne coming down, but you do, just along this edge, you've got all this escarpment where there's potentially lots of really interesting chalk headwaters coming off down into the Thame. Until recently there hasn't been a lot of information on it, but there's a project that the Chilterns AONB are running called Water and Dry Landscape, so that, which includes lots of surveying and monitoring. So next time we have a look at this analysis, we might find the Chilterns IFA actually becomes, Chilterns potential IFA becomes an IFA. So I'll go into a few of these in a bit more detail. So clean water creation and ponds. So Shabbington Wood, I mentioned its big area of woodland. So there are records for particular, so flies of conservation concern. So you can imagine they're not, there's not been a lot of monitoring for them after kind of those records. And I think they're pretty old, again, kind of 90s, early 2000s. But the work of FHT and New Conservation Partnership, there's been an awful lot of pond creation going on in the woodland. And I think it's a nice example of showing how actually working within these IFAs to protect it and expanding outwards, actually you can get some amazing gains from it fairly quickly. So the woodland's designated as SSSI, but for its butterflies, but it's got, so even kind of pre-2011 has quite a few ponds in the area. And it's a remnant of the wider Burnwood forest that used to be quite extensive. So there's been a few iterations of ponds going in. So in 2016, through the Million Ponds project, quite a few ponds were put in, and this has been added to by the Newt Conservation Partnership in later years. So back in 2011, a couple of the ponds had great crested newt recorded in them. More ponds added to the landscape, and you can see the newt starting to spread across the forest. And now in 2020, with sort of loads more ponds added, so there's really high pond density in the woodland. Newts are now across that whole woodland area. So by adding and improving the habitat in that IFA, there's been an amazing uptake in the species population. And what's been fab, so we particularly have data for newts, and it would be great if we had it for other things, because I'm sure there's been tons of dragonflies, and hopefully some of these flies of the species conservation concern, the flies that were found, are also benefiting from this, but we haven't actually had the funding to go back and monitor and look at invertebrates in detail, but it would be really fascinating to actually do that. One thing that has actually cropped up, and there were no previous records for this in wood, are so stoneworts. So these are quite indicative of new ponds and clean water. They're quite an early succession species. They're a macroalgae, if you don't know what they are. So they have amazingly huge cells. So each cell can be sort of a centimetre, several centimetres long. And these have just appeared. So whether they've been kind of in the seed bank, it's quite a wet wood anyway. So whether they're just waiting for wetter conditions to come back, or they've actually been dispersed back in the area. So yes, lots of interesting things popping back up that, you know, these ponds were particularly done for newts, but there are lots of other things benefiting as well. And you can see one of the newer ponds here. So they're just starting to vegetate up, but already full of common toads, so they're breeding. And yes, it would be fab to look at the invertebrates, but all in good time. And this is slightly an aside, but again, from some of the research of the Water Friendly Farming project, just to show how good it is to put clean water ponds back into the landscape. So Burnwood's quite a nice semi-natural habitat, but up in Loddington, where this research is being undertaken, it's quite typical farmed landscape. But they're finding that just clean water pond creation, they saw an increase in 26% of wetland plant diversity at the landscape level. So not every pond, but across the landscape. So really fantastic findings. So yes, fab to know that yes, hopefully wetland plants will also be benefiting in Burnwood as well, or Shabbington, sorry, there's a couple of names for it. The next, so this is just outside the IFA, but it's kind of worth noting again that these boundaries, they're guidelines, they're not necessarily a hard boundary. And the habitat here is quite similar. So there aren't as many records up this area, but potentially it's not been as well surveyed. And building along this floodplain, we can hopefully extend out from this IFA. And some of the records of interest down here, so I think there's bullhead and Lister's snail. Can't quite remember what else is out. There might be, I think there's records for ragged robin as well, and potentially some more records for tubular water droplet, so some restricted wetland plants as well. We can hopefully extend them along the floodplain and actually increase their distribution in the catchment. So this was a big wetland creation project that was in partnership with the Thame Conservation Trust and also the Waddesdon estate. So do say if you can't see my pointer, otherwise I just sound a bit like a mad lady telling you things, but there's excellent, good. So you can see the main river here. So this is all, when this floods, this really floods, it's really extensive. And there's big wetland you can see here that was put in last year, so it's still very new, and establishing in a big backwater down here. And so we're hoping that this will be will develop into kind of a really amazing site for freshwater biodiversity. So restoring that floodplain habitat and building out from that IFA. So it's a big wetland complex of lots of ponds of varying depths and sizes, and also a big backwater, which you can see here. So a complex of a mosaic of all different types of habitat, hopefully benefiting species that that will be on the river. So a big refuge for fish and juveniles, hopefully act as really nice like growing up grounds really. and also for some of the species more dependent on clean water, having this offline habitat here, so it's not connected to the river in any way, we hope that the water quality will stay better, and actually for the more common and more sensitive species like tubular water droplet, that will make for really amazing habitat. So it's only a year old, so it does still look a bit like a muddy pit at the moment, but give it a couple of years. But we're already seeing lots of lapwing, so it's really good for wetland birds at the moment because you've got those really nice muddy margins. Black-tailed skimmers, again, they like quite early successional habitat, but nice to see them turning up. The backwater, the EA came to survey the backwater the other day, and kind of a 500 metre square sweep, and there are about 12,000 fish, so it's really nice to see it's already being used. And what we could consider, so the site is going to be left to colonise naturally, but what could be considered in the future is using it as an ARC site, so we can actually use it to help reintroduce some of these species. So like tubular water droplet, a big floodplain species, and opposite leaf pondweed, and a few others that they're still in the landscape, but as they're not as readily able to disperse across the landscape, we can kind of give them a hand to get them more established, and then hopefully from there we can actually start kind of expanding them out into the landscape. So yes, quite an exciting project. It'd be amazing to see what it turns into. It's based on best practice and following very much the Pinkhill wetland mosaic that went in. It's about 30 years old now, but just to show you how effective some of these, just creating habitat and working out for these IFAs and working in the floodplain as well, can be. So Pinkhill Meadows, about 30 years old. It's on, so partnership project Thames Water and Environment Agency, but it now supports around 25% of wetland plants and freshwater species. And in its own right, it has become an IFA, so it is an important freshwater area. So newly created habitat becoming one of the most important areas in in Oxfordshire, just within 30 years. So hopefully we'll see that with the Waddesdon Wetland. So yes, hopefully we'll come back in 30 years. So the idea with this is, and hopefully you can see some of the scrapes in the background, but extending these areas of semi-natural habitat and using these floodplains, because they're not very productive lands, to make the most you can for wildlife. So creating this mosaic of habitats that goes down through the landscape and areas of kind of rough grassland. So yes, it's kind of hopefully a vision that we'll see expanding the Thame Catchment. And finally, just to talk about another site, so kind of hopefully giving you a range of the different habitats and what you can do and what we're doing to help kind of restore and protect the species there. But moving on to Spartum Fen. So this was one of the most diverse areas in the catchment. So it's an alkaline fen. It's become degraded over time, but it has old records for marsh hellebore, grass of Parnassus, marsh lousewort, marsh stitchwort. So again, quite old records, and it's not been managed for quite a long time. So lots of willow and alder growing up. And lots of these species like quite open conditions and like to get in. So there's a partnership project happening at the moment between Freshwater Habitats Trust and the Oxfordshire Fen group to actually go in and start doing management work on these fens, to hopefully get some of these species back, because you never know what might be kind of in the seed bank and what might just sort of appear without kind of, you just create the conditions and they might come back. That's not always the case, but focusing on where you have these old records in these areas with high species diversity, it's more likely to happen. So yes, that's been fab. So they've done pre-surveys and they've actually gone in and managed it. So hopefully we'll start to see some interesting things turning back up and continuing this over, this isn't just a go in and go out project. We're hopefully continuing this into the long term as well. Yeah, that was very much a kind of whistle-stop tour of the Thame IFA. So hopefully you can see how, we kind of compile the data and then how we're now using it to target conservation efforts where the best gains can be achieved. It's been incorporated into the Thame Catchment Plan. So it is hopefully being used by all partners to kind of inform their work. And we can now identify where there are gaps in our knowledge. So we can actually go back, are these species still there? where are we missing data, how do we what are the next steps, where do we take this forward to. If you're interested to see it, so the plan is online, and it has more details of everything really, and the records of what we found, and there's also a link to the Thame Catchment plan, so very happy to circulate that after the talk. And just to show you how it can be applied across any area. So each area can be really, really different. So you can see the Thame sitting there. This is Oxford, and this was IFA analysis for the whole of Oxfordshire. The blue are the IFAs and the green are the potential IFAs. And again, you can, if you know Oxfordshire, you can kind of pick out that actually quite a big lot of the IFAs are on the floodplain habitat. You've got the, I should actually just go to the next slide and it'll tell me rather than me trying to guess where the rivers are. But you've got the even load and floodplain here, upper Windrush, and pulling out more of the detail from the Oxfordshire IFAs. Again, it's a real mix of all the different types of freshwater habitats. So there's not one particular area or one particular thing that's going to be the best. It's the whole collection across the landscape. So you've got the up in the Ray, big floodplain meadows, nice ponds, and Otmore, again, really known for its birds, but it's got really nice populations of water violet. And yes, big floodplain areas, lots of these fen habitats kind of down along sort of south of Oxfordshire. Again, more chalk, stream. So a real mix. And nettlebed, that's a really nice pond complex in there. Yes, and to show you the difference in the amount of data available. So for Oxfordshire, the red shows the restricted species and the blue are the widespread, but you can see we had an awful lot more records to deal with kind of for the area, to just show you the Thame there. So yes, the more data you have, obviously the better informed it is, but you can still pull out some really key, you can still pull out the IFAs and use that to inform the work, even when you're missing or you're lacking very detailed information from the species anyway. So the Oxfordshire IFA has now been incorporated into the Nature Recovery Network, which is fantastic. So that's what you can see here. So this also includes terrestrial species, so not just freshwater, but really fab to see that being brought in, because often freshwater kind of, it can often be a bit left behind, I suppose, compared to other kind of woodland protection or grassland and that kind of thing. So that's really fab that it's all coming together in one place. Yes, and so just to kind of, because it's all well and good looking at maps, but it's nice to actually see some of the sites and to understand why they are so special and how, and sort of, what we're looking at when we want to expand out and improve them. So this is Otmore, it's sort of the Otmore area, so the RSPB Reserve, and also Ministry of the Defence land as well. And this is Shabbington Wood. So this is one of the IFAs that was important for the Thame Catchment, and then one of the Oxfordshire IFAs. So the data, because they've been done at different scales, it's not necessarily directly comparable. But what we can do for the Thame Catchment, and is kind of going to be quite a key next step, is actually trying to create habitat connections between these IFAs. They're super close. And there's lots of species still present on Otmore that we would like to get back to Shabbington Wood. So I've said the species quite a lot, but tubular water droplet was recorded in Shabbington Wood, but we don't believe it's still there, but it is there on Otmore. So hopefully we can kind of, encourage species to kind of colonize in if we create the right habitat in between. And this is just a picture of Otmore because it's beautiful. So this is one of the ponds that's in an old paleo channel of the river, but in May it's just full of water violet. So really, really beautiful and lovely. Yes, and lastly, just to talk about so the national IFA analysis. So you can scale it down, you can scale it right up again. So this is looking across all of England and Wales. I think they would have liked to have done Scotland as well, but we sort of draw the line somewhere. And so you can see Oxfordshire area has been pulled out as an IFA. You've got the Norfolk Broads, Yorkshire, Lowlands, and you've got sort of the New Forest down here. So lots of kind of key areas across the landscape. Yes, and just with the names. So sorry, this is the species diversity. Species diversity per 10 kilometre grid square. So quite quickly you can kind of pull out where you've got lots of these species still existing. So yes, we can, so the next step kind of with this IFA analysis and what FHT are pulling into as part of our next 20-year strategy is to using this information to develop a freshwater network. So using the IFA analysis to determine where we have the best sites, where we're going to get the best gains from building outwards from, looking at where we have opportunities to link up these IFAs, so creating new networks of clean water habitat across the landscapes, as I was saying with Shabbington Wood and Oxfordshire, actually creating those connections between those IFAs to aid that dispersal across the landscape. And also kind of going back to the Waddesdon Wetland, building in these floodplain reserves. So these areas that they're not particularly good for production, so hopefully we can maximise their potential for freshwater wildlife. And seeing what's coming through lots of the IFA analysis are big floodplain areas being quite key for freshwater biodiversity. Sorry, my phone is going. So yes, this will all be part of FHT's 20-year strategy. So launching early next year. So yes, please keep an eye out if you're interested to hear a bit more. So yes, my email address is there if you have kind of questions or you want to follow up with anything after the talk. And there's also more information on the important freshwater areas online, and just leaving you kind of with a sort of image of what we sort of hope to kind of develop, I suppose, and hope kind of, yeah, the IFAs can be really used to underpin is actually expanding these areas and building this nice mosaic of connected habitats across the land, not sort of connected spatially, not necessarily connected physically. So yes, thanks for listening, and yeah, happy to take questions.
Great, brilliant. Thanks, Hannah. That was a really fascinating talk, and great to hear all the information there, and especially your enthusiasm for all the species. It was great to see it and hear all about that. It was a really interesting piece of work and really useful, I hope, for people on the call. So we do have a few questions that have come in. So we've got first one from Sarah Clark, who said, it looks great, especially linking into the nature recovery networks. How did you go about finding the funding to do the initial mapping exercise?
So, this was a while ago. I can't remember where the initial funding came from. I think partly some of it came from CABA. So I'd need to double check this and get back to you. So it's my colleagues Jeremy and Pascal who have been really key in developing this approach, and also Naomi. So I've sort of come in at the end, so I've been quite keen in working in the Thame Catchment, which is why I know a lot more about it. But yes, they very much developed the approach in the early stages, but I think some funding came from CABA. For the Thame Catchment analysis, which I know more about, the funding came through a joint community project with the River Thame Conservation Trust. So that was actually funded by Thames Water as part of a kind of catchment engagement project. So that was fab. So we can then actually target what groups and community groups we work with next. And the Oxfordshire IFA has been funded by, I'd need to double check, but again, I think it has come, I'd need to double check, sorry. It's, yes, you know the bits you work on, and yeah, I can find out if it's of interest and yeah, circulate that.
Yeah, that'd be great. And we've got a question from Mike Beard here saying, does the work integrate with the upcoming local nature recovery strategies? Have you had involvement with that as part of these projects?
Yes, well, hopefully, well, for Oxfordshire, definitely, with it feeding in, it will hopefully be used to yeah, highlight where would be the best places for funding to be spent, so when funding is available. I'm not entirely sure how the kind of funding process for improving the nature recovery network is going to work, but having that in place and having freshwaters kind of keyly picked out through the IFAs, yes, will really help to make sure they're not kind of forgotten about, I suppose, going forward. So so no, that's fab, and they do kind of have the recognition and the amount of kind of detailed analysis going into it to properly inform that. What would be fab is to, I guess, do more for other areas, but funding is always a bit of a limitation because it's not the quickest analysis to put together really, and it does take quite a lot of time, mostly just trying to get records and data from all the different places you need. Once you've had it, it doesn't actually take that long to throw it into GIS and to start pulling it apart. But yes, hopefully it will be something that we can continue to grow and expand and do for further areas. So there is that information available to integrate into local plans and into recovery networks, and for that to be taken forward. Yeah. So yes, for some areas, yes, but we're hoping to build up.
Yep, and I know we've had some initial discussions with Jeremy about particularly the national analysis that you've done, being able to incorporate that in the CABA data package and the biodiversity work and share that with partnerships so they've got it available. Did you currently still draft? Are you still finalising that, or is it available?
Yes, yes. So sorry, yeah, still in progress. All the analysis is done. It's sort of dotting on all the I's and T's and finishing up the reports. But yes, that's it's very much part of the strategy. So the next few months, that's going to be kind of ready for properly kind of sharing more widely.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. And we've got another question here from Josh Jones, who said, have you considered a connectivity analysis like bug life's beelines at the national scale to help expand and join up the IFAs?
Yes, so I guess connectivity, yeah, probably not at that level. What we have looked at is where, I mean, potentially the way you would consider taking that forward is looking at where you've potentially got clean water habitat to link things. So ponds being a great way of doing that across the landscape. So because they're quite easy to put into kind of most landscapes and fairly small and quite cost effective. So I think looking at where you have good pond density and potentially adding to that and expanding. But yes, I think that's potentially kind of the next step is to then, and that's very much part of the strategy, is how we then create those networks and take that connectivity forward. But yes, on more on the ground in the Thame Catchment, I think the floodplain is a really good area for expanding that connectivity, because you do tend to have a really large area where you can connect that habitat, because it's not arable fields, you've got quite a lot of pasture, so you can create that connected network. So yes, again, it sort of depends on the habitat. For some of the fen sites, I suppose it's a bit harder to kind of connect in with other areas because they tend to be quite isolated habitats. So yes, with all these things, it's kind of, it really depends on what habitat and what species. But yes, I don't think I'm particularly familiar. Was it with the beelines connectivity?
Yeah, that was the one mentioned.
Yeah, sorry, I don't think I'm particularly familiar with it. So yes, hopefully that sort of, was enough of an explanation. But do write me an email if you'd like more information.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. We've got another question from Sarah here, who's asked if the initial mapping helped to pull out monitoring and survey priorities, where you identified there might be missing data, and did that help leverage the funding to do that?
Yeah, so that's the next step, and we've not quite got the funding to do it. So monitoring is always one of the hardest things to get funding to do. I mean, with Shabbington Wood, what would be amazing is there's a mechanism to monitor the newts through the Newt Conservation Partnership work. They're very focused, it's focused on newt habitat, and they have funding to actually go back and monitor, so they can show that those ponds are now breeding ponds and newts are colonising. But for those, it'd be so fascinating to actually go back and look at the invertebrates, because again, it's such specialist work that it's not something that you often have a lot of data for in catchment. And but yes, it would, I'm sure there would be loads of really interesting flies, maybe not the most eye-catching and exciting species, but lots of things that maybe would only be at that site in catchment. And again, with the floodplains, so with the Lister's river snail, it'd be really interesting to go back and see if that's still on the site. Not quite sure what we would then do to improve it, but again, that's all kind of the next step of actually looking at the species you've got and looking at detail how they might disperse across the landscape. So yes, I think Spartum Fen, Shabbington Wood, are going to be quite key to actually go back and monitor. We do have in the Thame Catchment, and I can show you another slide for, is quite a lot of bird monitoring data. So a bit separate, and we're using it kind of more as a like a supplementary extra nice thing to have to guide our work, because birds tend to be a bit more kind of widespread and less, I guess, less particular than some of these really specialist flies. Yes, sorry, I can't quite remember where I was going, but it's all kind of part of the next step is to actually go back and monitor. But yes, if you have ideas for where we could get funding to do lots of this monitoring, that would be amazing. But otherwise, we'll probably have to kind of fit it into practical projects as we're going along, and yes, and do it that way.
Have you ever, just thinking about the monitoring, have you ever used eDNA data or anything like that as part of this analysis?
So we haven't particularly used it in the Thame Catchment, but Freshwater Habitats Trust are very involved in, so there's PondNet, which is a national monitoring network for great crested newts. And we've been quite involved in lots of the research to actually establish how useful the technique is, because again, with DNA, it's still fairly new, and there's so many species you can look for that there's so much kind of field investigations to be done, really, to actually show that it does work for the species, because every species will lose skin and cells in different ways and will be present in environments differently. So for great crested newts, it seems to be really, really effective. So yeah, and kind of increasing the accuracy, I guess, of surveys. So instead of traditional techniques, much cheaper, instead of going out 7 times to torch or bottle trap, the DNA is proved much more effective on more difficult ponds. So if you've got duckweed covering it all, you might think there aren't any newts, but they are there. So that's been fab, and we're now starting to use it in other projects as well. So there's a couple of catchment projects we're running. So there's Pittsford Water Friendly Farming, which is in Northampton. And it's a similar project to the Water Friendly Farming project in Loddington. It's very much a follow-on. It's with Anglian Water. And we've been using it, it's looking at putting in commonly used measures to improve the landscape in a farms intensive landscape. So natural flood management, also biodiversity measures. And as part of that, we have funding to do baseline monitoring, which is fab. So we've been using metabarcoding eDNA kits to look for the whole amphibian suite and also fish. So we're starting to kind of look at the detail of that. We've still got a few question marks over it. And another project in Buck. So I think eDNA can be really, really interesting. I think as it's more developed, it's, it could completely change how we monitor freshwater invertebrates and fish, but there's loads of questions still outstanding to kind of figure out. So with some of the fish samples we've got, we know that this DNA is present in the water, but how far has that potentially traveled from upstream? In ponds, it's a bit easier because it's sort of a contained unit. So yes, it's one thing we're kind of exploring, and it's also a really fab thing for volunteers to get involved with, because it doesn't require lots of skill to collect a really credible sample. You walk around the pond for newts, you walk around the pond to collect your water sample, and you send that to a lab for analysis, so you can collect really accurate data. So it's really quite fab to use that as a citizen science technique and collect really credible data. So you couldn't go and send volunteers out to look for lots of these rare flies, but potentially in the future we can send them out with an eDNA kit, and that would, and they can do it that way. So yes, we're quite interested in it and kind of taking it forward, but lots to still investigate.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I think we've answered all the questions that people had posted, so thank you very much for that, Hannah. It was really interesting talk and really valuable, and great to be able to share that, so thank you for your time.
Fab.
Present that. I've posted the links that you had on your slides in the chat, so hopefully people have been able to pick that up. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll share the recording for today on the CABA website, so people can look back at that, and I'm sure you're more than happy for people to get in touch if they've got.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. So I feel like I probably rushed through a lot of things, but there is a lot of detail in the reports that are online. So if you are interested to see kind of a bit more step by step, but yes, and if kind of you are interested in and sort of taking it forward, I suppose in the catchment, a lot of it is just finding that data and making sure that you do kind of collect in all that you can on local knowledge. But yes, do email, get in touch.
Okay, that's brilliant. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you again to Hannah for your presentation today. Thank you.
Lovely. All right, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.